you know, we're going to kind of interview each other, but it's not fair to me because you're a professional interviewer now. You have a whole trademark, this thing with your glasses, your tie is askew. If people seen this on Bloomberg, it's great. David is a really terrific interviewer. It's like you're having a whole nother career.
But you've set me up now. If I interview you and the questions aren't good, people say, well, he wasn't as good as you.
Well, they'll know this is not on Bloomberg. And so at the beginning, I just watched the one with Clinton and W43. So, and the two of them were so nice to one another. It made me think like, gee, that was just another era. It's just like a...
Well, we agreed not to talk about Trump.
Okay, we're not going to do that. Yeah, we're not going to do that. But so each one starts with somebody coming in and saying, you know, your tie's kind of askew. And then you say, well, how about this? And then you kind of put it together, but you kind of don't put it together. And then they make a big deal out of your glasses. Your glasses are sort of like the trademark for the show.
I guess I think their producers, they came up with them. Actually, I didn't realize it that, you know, your tie is this way. That was unusual. But apparently everybody but me puts it in the thing here. And so I didn't do that. I've never done that. And all of a sudden they're making fun of it. I don't know.
I think we're all going to be doing that now. You know, like it's sort of a waste of fabric otherwise. So how did you get into becoming an interviewer?
Okay. Actually, what happened was this. At Carlisle, over the years, we had very prominent people come to speak at our annual conferences. And because we're in Washington, people would come to the conference and they would want to hear a former government person or talk about politics or something. So I would bring former presidents in, or former secretaries of state, and they would give a little speech. And after a while, I could see people looking at their watches and so forth. So I thought, why don't I interview them? Because I could make it a little more lively and maybe I'd intersperse a few humorous questions to keep people from falling asleep. And people seemed to like it. All right, and then right around after I started doing that, Vernon Jordan came to me and said, would you like to be, or not would you like to be, I want you to be the president of the Economic Club of Washington. I said, what is that? He said, it's a club of 100 business people. They meet quarterly. All you do is get a business person to come each quarter, let him or her make the speech. You go up and get questions come in from the audience, little cards. You read the cards, about 5 or 10 questions at the end, and then you're done. I said, okay, I'll get 4 speakers. All right. The first couple speakers were boring. They're putting people to sleep because they were reading speeches.
Sorry if you're here. Yeah.
Nobody was. Because the CEOs generally had these speeches written for them by somebody else. The questions would come in from the members, and the questions were worse than the speeches. They were just terrible. So I would pretend I was reading the question that came in from the audience, but I was making it up as I went along. And I figured that, you know, I'd make up humorous questions. So people laughed. After a while, I said, okay, I'm just going to go to interview format. So I started interviewing people, and I've down over 120 of them now. And we had Warren Buffett, Bill Gates, and so forth. And it worked out. And then some people said, why don't you go on TV? And I said, well, I don't know how to do that. Somebody went to Bloomberg and said, put this guy on TV, give him an interview show. So I started doing it, and it's worked out. I mean, I'm not giving up my day job, and there's no carried interest in interviewing. So it was a carried interest.
You actually have to pay tax on it.
Right.
Yeah.
Pay taxes. Pay taxes, just not the rate that you would like us to. But so anyway, I've done that, and it's actually interesting. And what I've tried to do is this: as I say on the show, I'm not a professional interviewer, and my job is not to embarrass people. I don't want to put them on the spot. There are journalists who can do that. So my job is to have a conversation with, they call it peer-to-peer, that was their title, but the idea is that I can talk to people who I'm not equal to, but I don't feel like I'm a journalist, a supplicant at the table, kind of begging for answers. So it's a conversation, and the technique that I've used, which has worked, I guess, so far, is this. What I try to do is I read everything about the person. If the person's written a book, I read it. If the person has had a lot of articles about them, I'll read them. Then I kind of memorize the background of them, and I write out the questions in my own thought process. And then I read the questions over. Then I send the questions to the person. Not because I'm going to ask those questions, but I want to make sure they're not worried about the questions I'm going to ask. So they relax because they think they know the questions. I might give them different ones, but they're,
very canny.
So then what I do is I have a conversation, and I don't use notes. People ask me about that, and the reason I don't use notes is that I feel that when you're doing this, not that belittle the notes you have, and you don't need them right now, but is that when you're having a conversation, if you have notes here, inevitably your eyes will look down. And the second your eyes look down, you kind of say to the person here, I'm not really having a conversation, I'm having an interview, and I need a crutch. So I try to say to people, I don't need a crutch. And if I have 40 questions prepared and I get 35 of them, nobody but me will know I missed 5. It doesn't make a difference. And I have them going in the way my mind thinks. I usually start out with a few generic questions, some are humorous, then go through their background, then go chronologically through their life, and then get a couple uplifting questions to end the thing on an uplifting note. And that's a technique. And I try in the TV show to kind of say, what makes these people tick? How did these people who came from typically modest circumstances rise up and become what they are? And it's worked. And, you know, the downside to it is this. I was at this conference in Riyadh, and where the Saudi government brought like 2,000 business people together. And a lot of people, I've known these people for years, but people come up to me and say, well, David, I just read that you've stepped down from Carlyle as a co-CEO. Nobody actually said that. They all said, I just saw your interview show. And they think, I spent 30 years building Carlyle, and now this interview show is like a year, and all of a sudden more people talk about that than my 30-year career. But okay, what can I do?
Well, you finally made good.
I guess so. Finally, took it. I agree.
Yeah, so it's great. So will you continue to do it?
Yes, and we'll have some variations of it. I'm working on something that will, with maybe somebody else, that would be a thing about America. I want to do a show that talks about America and talks about the great and the bad of our country, more the history of the country and so forth. And I have another interview program that I do. It's not on TV, but it's actually more rewarding in some respects. My theory is that members of Congress know nothing about our country's history, or modest amounts, I should say. So I started a program about 4 years ago to interview great historians in front of only members of Congress. And I underwrite a dinner at the Library of Congress where only members of Congress can come. And I bring in David McCullough or Doris Kearns Goodwin or the equivalent, and I interview them, and then let members ask questions. Other questions tend to be statements, not. But I do that, and members of Congress really like it because I require them to sit with people from the opposite party and the opposite house, and they're not usually allowed to do that because there's no press there seeing them. I broke the format this week on Tuesday night. I decided not to have a historian. I decided to do something more interesting. I thought, have the Chief Justice do it. So I know the Chief Justice because I'm the chairman of the Smithsonian and he's the chancellor of the board. And so I've gotten to know him over the years. And so I asked him if he would do this. He'd never done anything like this before in front of members of Congress, but he enjoyed it. It went pretty well. And, you know, so I enjoy the technique. Yeah.
Yeah. So I've done something like that. About a year ago, maybe it's a little longer, the Pew Foundation asked me if I could bring 2 justices to the House Judiciary Committee. So I contacted Justice Alito, teaches here some of the time, and is a father of a graduate, and Justice Breyer, who I also know. And the 2 of them came and they spoke about statutory interpretation, and there were members of Congress, also a few senators showed up. And it was great. And the people seemed to really enjoy it. There was no dinner.
It's interesting how, you know, with an interview format, you can keep people interested because if it's a speech, I've noticed that very few audiences can listen to a speech for more than 20 minutes without kind of looking at their watch, their iPhone or something, because very few people are so gifted speakers that they can hold an audience that long. I mean, there are few.
Yeah, well, we have trial lawyers in the room here, so I think the studies show that jurors give you about 2 minutes or so before they go off into some kind of fantasy land. They start thinking about dinner with their kids or something like that.
Well, let me ask you a couple questions.
All right.
All right. So
you're
first,
a professional.
All right. Your father was the famous dean of the University of Chicago Law School.
Is it true?
Where I went to law school. He was president of the university and attorney general.
Yes.
So when you're growing up, is it difficult to live up to those standards? And did you say, I got to get into a different area than the law because my father already was such a prominent person, and so therefore, why did you go into the law?
Yeah, I don't think kids think that way. And so, for one thing, I was just 17 when I left home. So because the University of Chicago had been experimenting, maybe we will experiment in the future here. I'm not predicting that, but they had, under Hutchins, Robert Maynard Hutchins, who was, I think, 29 when he became dean of the Yale Law School and 31 or something when he became president of the University of Chicago. And he was not what you would call a shy person. He was not lacking in self-confidence. He had the brashness of youth. He had a winning football team that had just won the national championship, and he said, we're not in the football business. He got rid of the football team. That was one of his first acts. And then they started they thought that we were keeping young people in school too long and that we could make it go faster. So they used the university laboratory school as a laboratory. It was a school that was founded or very influenced by John Dewey. And so you would go, in his era, you would go from your sophomore year in high school right into the college of the University of Chicago. Well, the remnant of that, when I was growing up in the 1960s, was that 7th and 8th grade were combined. You know, it was kind of the worst, the students were in middle school, they're just an abomination of nature, so let's just make middle school shorter.
I did the same thing, it was terrible.
And it was actually very hard on most students, but I've always felt that I had that year, and that I'm younger. You're younger than you, and that's why. Anytime I'm in any group of people, right, I always think I'm younger than them because I had 7th and 8th combined. Of course, it's increasingly irrelevant and not true. But
well, I did that. They had that in Baltimore, and it was terrible because I got to Duke. I was 16 years old.
Yeah, so I know it's pretty young. And the girls are, they
all seem like they're 30, but they're
I know
18 or something.
That's true, but they're not that interested. So the thing is, my father became president of the university and I was in my senior year at U High, and I was president of the senior class. So I thought, hey, pretty good, just like the Bushes.
All right. So, but your father, when you went at dinner,
I wasn't intimidated by it.
But at the dinner, he didn't ask you legal questions, or
yes, although not like my uncle. I had an uncle who was, you probably had him, Bernie Meltzer, yes, who was an interrogator, and so
he'd been a Nuremberg prosecutor.
He'd been a Nuremberg prosecutor, but he liked to question. And sitting at the dinner table there with my very close cousin, Dan Meltzer, just passed away, was an experience. It was like being on the witness stand. But it was very good for me, and I recognized that I had an advantage coming to law school eventually, just from that background and family. And I get that. If you don't have that experience, you have a little bit to overcome.
But you originally went to get a PhD in history, I thought.
That's right.
So
my father was very academic. I wasn't that rebellious, but I didn't feel, that I had that I was growing, that I was trying to be an acorn under this gigantic oak tree, and that there was just no sun coming through. He was very supportive, and in some sense not that interested in what particular choice I made. He thought they were all very reasonable.
You told him you were going to law school and you weren't going to Chicago.
Was fine with that. Yeah.
What did he say?
Well, he didn't make an issue of that. Phil Neal said to me, who was the dean at that time, said, "You don't have the guts to come to Chicago." And I said, that could be true. I didn't deny it, but you had the guts.
Well, they gave me a full scholarship. That's the reason I went.
Yeah, and now look what you've done. This Ruby thing is the worst invention of mankind. What's wrong with a Ruby at Duke?
I didn't go to law school here. I helped the law school. They gave me full scholarships. I applied to Duke Law School, and I did get in, and I thought I might come here, but in the end, Chicago bribed me. Bribery usually works, and so they bribed me to go there.
But I would like you to consider this, David, that at Duke, the professional schools subsidize the scholarships at the undergraduate level, and therefore, your gratitude should be directed at the law school.
Well, what about the business school and the medical school? What about them?
They would like a Ruby too. I'm pretty. They've authorized me to say that.
Well, there is a Ruby going to be here, and they called me the other day and said the Duke Arts Center, which is named the Rubenstein Art Center, they're not going to call it that anymore.
What are they going to call it?
Ruby.
The Ruby.
Yeah.
Well, that's really great. And if we had an art program here at the law school, I'd be truly grateful.
So let me ask you one or two other questions. One is, all right, so you became a federal judge.
That is
and when you're a federal judge, in your courtroom, you're God, and except for appellate court judges who can do what they want, basically, people have to listen to you.
That is true.
Why did you decide to leave where you're a God and come to a law school where you have to deal with faculty members and alums and donors and students? Isn't that a big change?
It's a big change, but I hope I know this will resonate with the judges in the room. When you're a judge, particularly at that trial level, and you have an enormous amount of power over people, obviously over criminal defendants, but also over civil litigants, and they hang on your every word. And you know, they're going back to their offices and they're writing memos to file and they're sending off things to insurance companies saying, gee, the judge has, you know, made this comment and I think we ought to settle. And so you know that. But it's not gratifying. You know, you don't sit there thinking, gee, I'm the most powerful person in the world. You're really trying to run a fair courtroom and a fair process. I think this is, if this does not motivate you as a judge, you're not a good judge. And so that's the kind of judge you want to be. So actually, you know, sentencing people, having power over people, that was never, ever my aspiration in becoming a judge. And in fact, it weighs on you.
Well, when you sentence somebody to jail, let's suppose not life, but 6 months, a year, 2 years, 5 years.
30 years.
Right, but I'm talking about the shorter sentences. So when they get out,
right?
You're never worried that they might be coming after you?
No. That actually
Never thought about that.
that never happened, and I didn't worry
about it.
Well, it's not the kind of thing you worry about. You know, I'd been a prosecutor. You have to remember that. And I've been U.S. attorney, and I was not one of those U.S. attorneys who would, you know, at the end of the sentencing, very few people do this, you know, would go over to the defendant and say, "Here, I got you a toothbrush," because you know, you didn't lord it over people. It's like you're doing your job, and then, you know, people would come back, and then they would be on supervised release, and you would work with them. Many of them had problems staying free of the criminal justice system after they got out, and so it's a kind of a continuing relationship. Right before I came here, right before I came here, I was threatened. I was in San Francisco, and my cell phone went off. And it was an IRS agent, and he said, Judge Levy, he said, I need to tell you that there is a credible threat on your life. And I said, oh, really? I said, well, when did you learn this? And he said, about a week ago. That's how valuable we are. So he said, I think you should talk to the U.S. Marshal about getting some enhanced security. So I talked to the Marshal, and he says, the person I talked to says, well, there's not all that much we can do. We're going to chase down the threat. He said, in the meantime, I suggest you get a gun. I don't know, is Nancy in the room? So I said, oh, okay. So I went home, and I said to Nancy, they're recommending that I get a gun. And she said, listen. She said, with your eyesight, she said, either you'll shoot me by mistake or I'll shoot you on purpose.
All right.
So, no gun.
All right, so now...
let me ask you, I mean, you're such a prominent person. Do you worry about personal security?
I actually have never done that, worried about it, because typically when you're in government or you have that kind of the power that government officials have, that's where you often see these things. So far, no private equity person has been shot that I know, I'm aware of. Could be the first, but people do ask me that. When I go to a lot of countries that are... where their safety is not always so wonderful, though you could argue the United States isn't so wonderful either, but when I go to countries that have histories of kidnapping and so forth, people have asked me about it, but I concluded that the best way to draw attention to who you are is have security. Mm-hmm. So I try to be relatively anonymous when I'm going to meetings and so forth, and I'm not going out to bars and walking around at late at night. I basically do my meetings and go to the hotel room, and so I've never really worried that much about it.
But now you're going to be more of a public figure with the Bloomberg thing and, you know, show on America.
We'll see. I'm not that worried about it. Let me ask you this.
Okay.
Now, you decided to step down after 11 years. What are you?
17.
I'm sorry.
Oh, here 11.
Here,
yeah.
11 years is dead.
Yes, that is true.
So what are you going to do next?
Yeah, well, I don't actually know what I'm going to do now. I hope there will be a role for me here. That's what I do hope. You know, I'm going to be president of the American Law Institute, and then I do some other things that are time-consuming. I went on the board of the National Parks Conservation Association. I'm on a public company board, a few other things. I might do some private judging, but I hope that there'll be a role for me here.
And are your children, and are they in the legal world?
I have a son who's a lawyer in D.C., one son, and then another son who works with my wife on the ranch.
Okay, and so did you encourage your children to go to law school, or?
Well, not really. I mean, it's not because I wouldn't encourage them, but I never wanted to be that directive with my children about what they ought to do. But so the son who was interested in going to law school, I was certainly quite encouraging about it, because I think I think it was and is a great career, notwithstanding the fact that you left the law. But,
well, I left the law because I wasn't good at it. I mean,
I'm doubting that. I've heard you say that, but I'm just going to say I don't think so.
to be honest, I was on the law review at the University of Chicago, but I wasn't editor in chief, and I wasn't a Supreme Court clerk. You were president of the law review.
Well, you just missed the very top.
Okay,
there's still room for people like you.
When I went to practice law, I realized I was at Paul Weiss for 2 years, and I realized that you have to be obsessive about the law and really want to make sure you get in the corporate world, get those typos and make sure you've got all the documents. And I just didn't have that obsessive compulsive feeling. And I also was thinking about, this my life is just going to be, worrying about these typos and so forth. That's what they did in some of the law firms that I was a Cravath Summer associate and a Paul Weiss associate. And I would say that there were people there clearly more committed to the practice of law than I was, and I wasn't really that committed to it. And my theory has been, if you're going to do something in life and be successful at it, you have to love it. If you don't love what you're doing, you'll never be great. People that win Nobel Prizes don't win them doing something they hate or doing it 9 to 5, 5 days a week. You have to love it and have a passion for it. And I just didn't have it. And so I wanted to work in government. I went to work at the White House for President Carter for 4 years. You could argue I didn't do a good job because we got inflation high, but...
Did you love that, though?
I loved it.
Yeah.
I didn't take a day off for 4 years because you're 27 years old. You're the deputy domestic policy advisor to the President of the United States, a job you're not qualified for, but you don't think Carter's qualified either. So, you're sitting there, and so it was fun.
And you guys, just like today, you were trying to get inflation up, so you got it up to 19%. That was phenomenal.
Nobody did it better than that. So, but the problem is, to be serious, when I went, people used to tell me, all the lawyers and lobbyists used to come all the time. You've got an office in the West Wing. People are going to lobby you, of course. And all these famous lawyers would come in and tell me why their clients' needs were so great and so forth to the country. And by the way, if you ever need a job, they didn't say it in the same conversation, but they have lunch and say, you're a bright young man, if you ever want to leave, call me up. Okay. The day we lost the election, I called them up and none of them called me back. Because, who wants to know about a Carter White House aide's expertise when Reagan's going to be president? And so the complicated thing was that I figured, okay, it'll take me a couple of weeks to get this done, but then after, the administration was over on January 20th, I still didn't have a job. And so my mother was worried that, no job. So I said, well, I have so many offers, I don't know which one to take. So she said, well, okay, when are you going to take it? I said, by the end of January. Then February, March, April, May, June came around. I still didn't have a job. She said, David, why don't you just take one of these offers? But the truth is, I finally got some law firm that felt sorry for me. I went back, and I wasn't that great at it, again, because, one, I didn't love it, but also the skills that a young lawyer should develop between the years of 3 and 7 out of law school, where I was playing games at the White House. I was not really doing those lawyer skills. So when I went back to practice law, I didn't really have the skills commensurate with my class, and therefore I had to do what lawyers may do, which is to not be a great lawyer, qua lawyer. I was basically spending my time getting clients. So I realized that the legal world had become a business to some extent, and if you brought in clients, you were more heavily rewarded than if you did the work. So I figured, well, why should I learn how to do the work? I'll just bring in the clients. So any of you familiar with this phenomenon? And, so I was reasonably good at getting clients, but I didn't know if I want to spend my whole life doing that. And then when I started my firm, I realized that it's a more lucrative way of spending your hours. And so if you're going to spend time doing things that, or in the business commercial world, I thought I should do it where it was probably more lucrative.
So that was pretty daring, though, to leave practice at that point. And to go into business, into a particular kind of business that wasn't as obvious then as it maybe now. You would say, oh, gee, I'll go into private equity. But then I don't think you would have said, oh, I'll start a private equity.
It's true. In hindsight, I shouldn't have done it. But in hindsight, you'd say Jeff Bezos was crazy to try to sell books over the internet or all these things. So when you look back at companies that have taken off, the founders all had crazy ideas. And what makes them work is the founder will walk through walls to prove his or her idea is good, and you just have to be persistent, and never take no for an answer. So in the end, I loved what I was doing, and I thought I had an idea about building a global firm, and it worked out. And I thought about myself, if I hadn't done this, let's suppose I had said, look, I'm a mediocre lawyer, but I'll do what lawyers in Washington sometimes do. Peter is a serious litigator, but Washington lawyers are often, who have government backgrounds, they're going back and forth, successively getting more senior positions. And so I suspect I would have gone back into government in some other administration and been assistant secretary, and maybe I would have been the administrator of some agency at some point. But it would have been a life where by now my law firm would have kicked me out, because I'm 68 now, and many law firms say at 65, 67, 68, you kind of retired. Most of my classmates, I'm at University of Chicago, class of 73, are more or less retired or retiring or being forced to retire. But I would have had a career, would have been a lawyer that nobody would have ever heard of, who probably didn't do very much. And I just, I'm glad that I got out of the practice of law, but I'm also glad that my son is going to law school. Right. And if I had to do it all over again, I would have done one thing differently. At the time that I graduated from Duke in 1970, to be very serious, I hope I don't get in trouble for saying it's the best students, the really best students, they were going to medical school. And the second best were going to get PhDs. And the third best were probably going to law school. The fourth best were probably going to the workforce. And the last best, they were going to business school. This has changed, because in those days, and Duke didn't even have a business school then, but in those days, the idea that you could go into business and create a great fortune relatively quickly mean 10 or 20 years, didn't exist. There were no hedge funds, private equity funds, technology startups. If you went into business other than your family's business, you were working for Procter & Gamble or AT&T, and you would work your way up over 30 years, and maybe you get somewhere to the top, but most likely you wouldn't. And so it wasn't as sexy and appealing. And so the couple of my classmates at Duke who went to Harvard Business School, and those days you could go directly out of college, I barely knew them. They were not distinguished scholars at Duke undergraduate. They happened to be near the bottom of the class when they get into Harvard Business School, because those days it wasn't that hard. Today, it's a little bit obviously different. Business school is attracting better people than it did before. If I had to do it all over again, I would have gone into a joint degree program, the JD MBA. My son is going to try to do that at Stanford, because I think the legal reasoning is much better than the reasoning you get in business schools. And I think law schools attract higher IQ people than business schools do, with some exceptions. But generally, people in law schools, I think, are more intellectually skilled in some ways. And I think the legal training you get and reasoning is good, but I think understanding business is probably useful too. So the JD MBA program, which is not has grown as much as I thought it would over the years, is probably what I would do today, and my son is going to do the same, as I mentioned. Yeah,
I think it's actually an interesting degree, and it's something that we've looked at a lot here. It's pretty the JD MBA, the numbers are pretty static. There very few students take it, and now joint degrees, because of the expense, are even more disfavored. So we started a JD LLM LE, Law and Entrepreneurship, right, which is folds into the 3-year program with a little bit of summertime. And that's been somewhat more popular. But what's really going on is that the JD curriculum has become so rich with business curriculum.
Right, okay.
And so, your son may look at it and say it's worthwhile, or he may look at it and say, gee, I've done most of that stuff. I should just take finance over at the business.
Well, I don't know whether he's doing it because he wants to impress me that he wants to have a business background, or he wants to postpone going into the workforce another year. I don't know. But I recognize that 90% or 95% of the people get JD MBAs are going to business.
Yeah.
So if that's the case, you might say, well, why do I want to get a JD and spend 4 years in graduate school? I can work for a couple of years, get an MBA. The opportunity cost is not as great. So that's why probably the programs haven't grown as much, though if I had to do it over again, I'd like to have an MBA.
So if you did it over again, you'd get a JD MBA, and then would you go into business, and where would you go?
Well, I would have done some investments that I passed on. I would have done those investments. So
yeah.
If I'd had, I was given a chance to invest in Facebook at the beginning when Mark Zuckerberg was at Harvard, and I said this was going nowhere. That was not a good thing. And then when Jeff Bezos was starting his company, he offered my firm and me 1/3 of the company in exchange for some things, and we turned it down. So
you'd like a do-over?
Yeah, I'd like a do-over a couple of those deals. But I think today what I would probably do is want to have more of a business background, maybe do public service later in my life, and kind of get the money-making career part earlier. But either way, I recommend people doing some public service, doing it early or doing it later. But the fulfillment that you get, as you know, from serving in government, serving your country, can be pretty good.
So what do you do when you find yourself, for whatever reason, you have a day off? You're not flying someplace, you're not totally exhausted, and but you have some time. What is the sort of ideal way that you would spend that time?
I know you won't believe this, but it doesn't happen anymore because I'm on 32 or 33 nonprofit boards, and I chair 7 of them. And I have these programs where I have to read a lot of books. And so if I have 3 or 4 hours and not scheduled, then I'll read some of the books that I got to prepare to when I'm interviewing people. But I probably have overscheduled myself. And
I think the wisdom of the crowd is yes.
Right. I have a theory that if you relax and you relax too much, your immune system will go to sleep and relax, and then germs will come in and attack a sleeping immune system.
Okay, that's interesting.
I don't want that to happen.
Yeah, that's an interesting theory.
Let me. I didn't go to medical school, so I don't know. Maybe it's not right. Yeah. But look, if you love what you're doing, and look, I'm at the point that my firm announced, or I announced earlier this week, that at the age of 68, my co-CEO and I were stepping down. Now, we'll make ourselves executive co-chairs. We still have, large amounts of money invested in the company, and we'll be the biggest shareholders. But we decided it was a good idea for every younger generation to take the lead, and we're happy to do that. But I everything I'm doing in the nonprofit side, just like the thing I'm doing at Carlyle, I love. So I have no nonprofit that I don't love.
Right.
I love being chairman of the Kennedy Center. I love being chairman of the Smithsonian. I love being chairman of the Library of Congress Board, or now the chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations. I love these things. And so none of these things are work. It's just I have to have enough time to do them. But my biggest fear is I won't have time to prepare for things. So I have to make, like on Monday, I have 4 speeches in 4 different cities.
This coming Monday.
This is coming Monday. And I have West Point in the morning, New York, Philadelphia, and then Washington. And it's a very tight schedule. But I need to be prepared for each of them. I have to have a different speech. You can't give the same speech.
Why different? Why not just give the same speech?
Well, because you might have this, in the age of the internet, already, will see what you've given the same speech, and I just don't think it's good. And also, intellectually, I want to have a different speech and different audiences, different kinds of things. As you get older, and all of some people are my age here, or roughly, you do worry about what happens when you hit a certain age. The body and the mind are not necessarily going to fall apart at the same time. You don't know which one is going to fall apart first, the brain or the body. And when you see your classmates, and some of you may have this phenomenon as well. When I was growing up, my parents used to read the obituary pages. I said, what are you reading this for? Now I read the obituary pages first, because I want to see which of my friends are still around or not. And you have to be very serious. You don't know when something bad will happen. And so I want to be active and not look back at 5 years from now and say, well, I wish I had done this or done that, but because I took a month off just to relax or sit on the beach, I didn't do it. So I just want to get things done, and I don't want to relax in a traditional sense, but everything I'm doing is relatively relaxing for me. When I make a speech, it's relaxing. It's not, it's not pressure. I don't sweat making a speech or doing an interview. So these are fun things. I just wish I had more time in the day, and I just hope my body and my brain won't give out before, too long. Yeah.
You look good.
Well, but I had a makeup artist this morning working on me, and actually I did an interview.
I'd like the name.
What?
I'd like the name.
Well, actually, one time I was doing an interview to kick off the Harvard Capital campaign. They asked me to get Bill Gates to come. So I asked him if he would do and he hadn't been that close to Harvard, but he said he would do this, and I've interviewed him before, and I know him reasonably well. So we get there in the green room, and there's a woman there, and I said, who are you? She said, I'm Bill Gates' makeup person. Really? He has a makeup person? I didn't know he cared about that much. Okay, she makes him up. Then we go and do the interview. Well, his socks are down to here. The suit doesn't match, the pants don't match the jacket. He's got a mustard stain here, and the tie is all askew, and it's got some mustard and a ketchup on it, and his hair is always down here, and his glasses never fit. If you ever notice Bill, he's going like this all the time. You kind of say, Bill, if you really care about the way you look, don't worry about the makeup artist. Get somebody to clothe you properly. But
people say he has such nice skin, probably. So let's talk about Duke, because you've had a lot of experience with different university boards, and you were chair of our board up until last year, and did such a marvelous job and through the campaign, which we're celebrating today.
Oh.
And So how would, the question that you always want to know on your interview shows, like, what makes a person tick? Well, what makes Duke tick, and what makes it different than other schools that you know so well?
Duke is a school that has gone through an enormous transition. When I was here, it was considered the Harvard of the South. Well, the implication is it wasn't good enough to be Harvard, but it was okay for a Southern school. And at the time, it was, of the private universities in the South, I think probably the best one. There was Tulane, Rice, Emory, Vanderbilt would be considered very good schools as well. Interestingly, Duke has bypassed them dramatically, in my view, and now stands not as the Harvard of the South, but as one of the best universities in the country. And I think no university that is as young as Duke has risen as high as Duke is. No university that has an endowment of Duke's size is as highly ranked as Duke is. Why is that? Well, Duke has, for a lot of reasons that no one person could control or is responsible for, Duke has a beautiful campus setting. It's not in an urban area. They're good urban area schools, but this is a beautiful campus where people are trying to strive harder. They want to prove that Duke is a great school, so they work together. And I think it's a more collaborative atmosphere than some other universities I'm familiar with. It also has a attitude where, at least the undergraduates, when they graduate, they seem to be happy. They're not neurotic. Undergraduates who graduate from other schools, they either don't like the school that much, or sometimes they're neurotic, or they're different. Here, people seem to graduate and they really love the school. So you've got a school where people work together. It is still always kind of do better, so it isn't always a mission to kind of get the school better. In a beautiful setting where there's a lot of collaboration, and it's on the rise. So I think it's a very good school. Now, the university that I think Duke is the most comparable to is Stanford. Stanford also has a beautiful setting. You went to the law school there. You're very familiar with it. Beautiful setting as well. They were then the Harvard of the West when I was an undergraduate. Now they're obviously bypassed that appellation, but they like Duke, try to have first-class academics, first-class athletics, a beautiful setting, cooperative environment. So I think it's a very good school for Duke to compare itself with. And when I became the chairman of the board, I took the entire board out to Stanford to let them see what Stanford's done, and we came back with some ideas of things we've done, but we also came back with some things we realized that we shouldn't do because Stanford's done them, but maybe didn't do them as well as they should have, and we're happy with what we have. I think Duke's a school that everybody should be proud of. And as I've said, and you've probably heard me say this many times, everybody has an incentive, if you go to a school or law school, to give back to the school for this reason. Let's suppose when I went to Duke, it was easy to get in, relatively speaking. I went back with the admissions director and said, okay, how did I get into this school? Well, fortunately, he didn't have my application. But he had this statistic that showed at the time that I applied to Duke, I think it was 6,000 applications and 3,000 people got in. So 50% of people got in, 50%. Today, Duke is probably getting in about 8 or 9% acceptance. And we have 34,000 applications last year. We'll probably have 36 or 37,000 this year. When I went to Duke, it was a good school, but it wasn't a great school. And so today, as Duke has risen, people think I'm smarter than I am because they say, well, look, you went to Duke. Wow, that's a great school. I didn't tell them, look, 50% of people got in those days. It wasn't that hard to be a Duke student then. It wasn't that hard to graduate. So you have an incentive to make your law school, your business school, your undergraduate do better, because if it does better, people think you're smarter. There was a ranking recently. You're too modest to mention it, but
I mentioned it this morning.
All right.
More than once.
All right. So, number one is pretty good.
Yeah.
So, if you go to Duke Law School and you're now ranked number one, people say, well, you must be really smart. Now, when you went to Duke Law School, maybe it wasn't as good, but people don't look at it that way. Now, if Duke went to number 20 and it was number 5 when you went here, you would be upset because people think you're not as smart as you are because you were number 5 at one point or 4, whatever what might have been, and now it's number 20. So you have an incentive to make the school because people think you're smarter than you might really be by making the school look better.
Well, that's part of the story. But there is some mystery here about the university. I think that just that it has done so well. I mean, you compare it to Stanford, and it's a good comparison. I've done that myself. Because there's something about the vibe that's very similar. But Stanford has so much more money now.
Stanford is in a different league in terms of its resources. Harvard has the biggest endowment, not per capita. Harvard's endowment's $38, $39 billion. Next is Yale, probably $23 billion. Then Princeton's about $18 billion. Stanford's around $18, $19 billion. Duke which is now ranked overall maybe 7 or 8 or something like that in U.S. News rankings, has an endowment of about $7.5 billion. So we're microscopic compared to that. And so think about that. And the university really started in the late 1920s. And we can, sometimes Duke plays it both ways. When we want to say we're an old school, we say, well, we were the original Trinity and Browning school in 18 something or another. But the truth is the university was reborn around 1928, 29, and that's really when the university started. No other school in the top 10 or top 20 is that young. And no other school in the top 10 has an endowment roughly our size. So Duke is done pretty well. And it's a combination of many things that made it happen. The law school has, obviously, since you've been here, the rankings have gone
through the roof.
They've done spectacular. I think that the law school should put up a collection to convince you to stay another 5 years or so, but I don't know if they're going to do that. I think it's the law school is done extremely well. It's well respected by everybody I know. The applications are up, and you've done a great job and deserve a lot of credit for it. So I hope we can find a successor who is half as good.
Absolutely. Well, we'll find a successor who will be even better. One of the big differences between the private world and the world of universities is that, just as you announced last week, you feel quite obligated as part of your role, I think, to have succession plans and to develop people and then to choose them. Whereas in a university, or at least in this university, the leadership does not have that role. And in fact, they're asked to step aside and make room for the others, but not to identify the others. So it's a very different process.
It's not unlike the selection of a pope, right? The current pope isn't supposed to pick his successor, right?
Exactly. That's it.
But it is interesting. In the business world, you're considered, one of the jobs of a CEO is to groom his or her successor.
Right.
And if you haven't done it, you're considered less good as a CEO. In a law school setting or university setting, that's not the case. The university president and dean are not supposed to groom their successors. Right. Why that is, I'm not completely sure, but I'm involved now in the presidential search at Harvard. And, the Drew Faust, the current president, she's completely uninvolved. And Dick Broadhead was completely uninvolved in the search for his successor here. Yep. You saw earlier today the president, and the new president, and he's, sure the right person. I was pretty involved in that selection, but Dick was just not involved at all. I don't know why the universities do it that way.
But it is a difference. Well, we've talked about Duke. Let's talk about the country a little bit and patriotic philanthropy. So I think we all appreciate your deep love of the history of this country and for its essential documents and the documents of the the common law tradition that is so important to individual liberty, your appreciation of that. So I think everybody here would just encourage you, but how did you, when was it or how was it that you decided that you would really focus on this?
When I was very young, some of you may have a similar experience if you're roughly my age. John Kennedy gave his great inaugural address on January 20th, 1961. Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. My sixth grade teacher went over that word for word with my class, and it was clear to me then that it was poetry in prose form, and I just didn't have the desire to make a lot of money. My desire was to go in the government and help my country. And so that's why I went to law school. I really wanted to go into government, work in the White House and politics and so forth. And I went to work for Ted Sorensen, who was the man who wrote that speech with John Kennedy. And maybe I went there principally because I was inspired by him, and I really was inspired by John Kennedy. I'm the chairman of the Kennedy Center. I'm the biggest donor to the Kennedy School at Harvard, and I'm the biggest donor to the Kennedy Library. So I've probably given more money to things named after Kennedy, and maybe it's because of this fascination I had with him and what he tried to do to say.
You're giving me an idea, but go on.
So I felt that I wanted to give back to my country, and I thought I would do it by working in the White House, and I did it. But as I said, I got inflation of 19%. Wasn't clear that I had given back much to my country. So what happened, honestly, afterwards is sure, I loved the history of working in the White House, and you do feel you're helping your country, all jokes aside, by working there. But clearly, it's very political, and some people hate you, some people don't like you so much as you would like. It happened by serendipity, and many of the greatest things that happen to anybody in life happened by serendipity. And what really happened was this. I was working at Carlisle, and I'd made a fair amount of money, and I was, beginning to give away money to educational and medical research things, and the usual things that people give money away to when they get more money than they really need. I read about an auction, I was invited by an investment bank to a viewing of something called the Magna Carta, and it was in Sotheby's, and I said, wait a second, what's it doing in Sotheby's? It should be in London somewhere. So I happened to be in New York that day. I went to see it because a friend of mine invited me, and it turned out that there are 17 copies of the Magna Carta, 15 in British institutions, one in the Australian Parliament, and one was owned by Ross Perot. He'd bought from a family that had it in his possession from England for 500 years. When that family was land poor in the early 80s, he sent his lawyer, I think it was named Tom Luce, over to get it and to buy it and preempt the auction that was then going to happen in Sotheby's, an earlier auction. And he negotiated to buy it for like $1.5 million. He then rolled it up in a tube and went back through British Customs. The British Customs person said, Mr. Luce, what's in that tube? He said, the Magna Carta. Oh, sure, go ahead through. He didn't believe it. So ultimately, it was at the National Archives. Ross Perot, for whatever reason, put it up for sale. The curator told me he was going to go to somebody from outside the country, and they kind of identified who was likely to be the winning bidders within, they didn't give the names, but they said the countries. And so I just decided right then and there, this was the inspiration for the Declaration of Independence. While it wasn't written in this country, it was actually something that's important in our country's history because the founding fathers all thought that their colonial charters had said that they had the rights of all Englishmen, and the rights of Englishmen including the rights of the Magna Carta. So I thought it was important to our country's history, even though it wasn't drafted here, and the one copy that was in the country should stay here. So I just resolved to buy it, and I went, I didn't tell my wife because it sounds presumptuous to say to your wife, I'm going to go buy the Magna Carta tomorrow night. And I didn't want to tell my children. They would say, how much less money might this mean for us? So I went back the next night, and I wasn't an art collector then. I just went to Sotheby's, and they put me in a little room and started bidding, and all of a sudden the guy came in, said, you won. He said, who are you? We never saw you before. And I told him who I was. He says, do you have the money for this? I said, yes. I said, okay, you can go out the side door if you want. Nobody will know who bought it. Or you can go and talk to these 100 reporters, and these reporters want to know who bought it. And I said, well, I'll go out and talk to them. And I went out and said, look, I came from very modest circumstances. I had nothing when I started. Now, because of this country, I've been able to be very fortunate, and I now want to give back to the country in many ways, and this is a down payment on my obligation to give back to my country. So I'm going to give this to the archives on a permanent loan, and when I die, it will go there permanently. And so that's where it is. And so I then started, and right after that night, I went to have dinner at the president of Citicorp's house, and I said, I'm sorry I'm late, I just bought the Magna Carta. The next morning, it was on the front page of the New York Times, and he says, David, I didn't take you seriously. I thought it was a joke. Nobody's ever come to my house before and bought the Magna Carta. So anyway, I started other people, told me about other documents. So the 13th Amendment, which freed slaves, the Emancipation Proclamation, Declaration of Independence. There are rare copies of these. The originals are probably the real originals, or the one when there's only one, let's say, Emancipation Proclamation. But Lincoln signed 47 souvenir copies, and there are copies of these things around. So I began to get interested, and I'd buy them, put them in places where people could see them, on the theory that if you saw the original, you might be inspired to go back and learn more about the history of the document and maybe learn more about American history. Because so many people know so little about our country's history. We don't teach civics in junior high school much anymore, and you can graduate from any college now and not have to take an American history course. You can graduate from 80% of the colleges in this country as a history major and still not take an American history course. So the results are things like this. A recent survey by Annenberg in the University of Pennsylvania about 3 weeks ago came out and said that 3/4 of Americans cannot name the three branches of government. 3/4 of Americans can't name the three branches of government. And 1/4 of Americans cannot name one branch of government. 10% of Americans now believe that Judge Judy is on the United States Supreme Court.
It could happen.
So, good. So I began the process of buying these documents and putting them on display. And then when the Washington Monument had its earthquake damage, I said to the head of the Park Service, look, how long does it take to get this fixed? And he said, dealing with Congress, it can take me 2 years or so. I said, forget Congress. I'll give you the money. Just, cut out the Congress. So I did that, and then later he called me back and said, there's a problem. Congress says they get no credit for doing anything good. Can they put up some of the money? I said, okay, fine. So I did that, and then when I went to visit Monticello, it was kind of falling down, and I kind of said, okay, I'll put up the money to fix it, and same with Montpelier, James Madison's house, and other things I've done. And so I have I'm doing now this with the Lincoln Memorial. I'm helping to redo the Lincoln Memorial. We're putting underground education center there, and then the same with the Jefferson Memorial. I haven't announced it yet, but eventually I will announce that we're going to build an underground education center there so people can learn more about history. I've called this together patriotic philanthropy. And while it's about 5% of my philanthropy, it gets 95% of the attention, because if you give $50 million for medical research, it's very nice, but people don't pay attention because Bill Gates is giving $2 billion or something. But if you give $20 million to fix up the Lincoln Memorial, nobody else is quite doing it, so it gets more attention. But in any event, that's what I've done, and that's how I got into it. And I'm going to do a lot more of it. And I intend, as you know, I've signed the giving pledge, and I intend to give away not half my money, but I'm in the process of giving it all away, not all to the Duke Law School, but to other places.
We don't need all of it.
I know.
We wouldn't ask you for that. So as you sort of look at the world and at the country, maybe we could talk about the economy. You know so much about it. What do you see over the next 5 years?
Well, the economy is hard to completely understand. I don't think anybody really understands it in this sense. We've had recessions every 7 years since World War II ended. And we are now 8.5 years into a growth cycle. The recession technically ended in June of 2009. Now, how do we know that? Well, the National Bureau of Economic Research, which is a think tank in Cambridge, Massachusetts, they determine whether you're in or out of a recession. The U.S. government doesn't want to be blamed for saying that, so they don't actually do it. They outsource it. But the National Bureau of Economic Research said June of 2009, recession's over. Now, if you're still unemployed, you didn't agree with that. But it's over then. Now we're 8.5 years into a growth cycle. At some point, we are going to go into a recession. I don't know when that will be. I had thought it would be sometime this year, but clearly the so-called Trump phenomenon has defied everybody's expectations that the economy would slow down. For whatever reason, people thought that the economy would be propelled because of tax cuts or deregulatory actions, and none of those actions have really happened yet of any consequence, but still the market is much more ebullient than I would have expected to be. At some point, I think the economy will slow down. I think the issue most economists now look at it and say it probably won't slow down for another 2 or 3 years because there probably will be a tax cut. While it's going to produce a bigger deficit, people don't seem to care about that anymore. Probably we are getting some deregulatory things that will probably propel the economy a bit. So I think the economy is in reasonable shape. 3% growth is not ridiculous. 4% is out of the question, but 3% growth for the next couple of years is not ridiculous. It's probably somewhere between 2.5% and 3%. Unemployment will probably stay around 4.5%. Now that number is a little misleading because we measure unemployment by how many people look for a job in the last 30 days, and so the real unemployment rate, the so-called marginally attached rate, is probably closer to 6 to 8%, but still not so bad. Inflation is not what I could get it to. It's probably under 1%, really 1.5% at the most it's going to be. I think the new Fed chair, whoever that might be, is unlikely to change dramatically and increase interest rates too much. So I think the economy is in reasonably good shape. China is in reasonably good shape, and Europe is actually doing better than the United States. So it's all these things defy expectations. So I think the economy is pretty good. Now, as an investor, it's complicated because things are expensive. So it's hard to go buy things at bargain prices anymore because everything is very, very expensive. But still, people like we are buying things, but we're not going to get the high returns that we're used to.
What is the most concerning element of the international situation?
Well, number 1, 2, and 3, and 4 is North Korea. Maybe because of our rhetoric or their rhetoric, you are in a situation where not since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 have we actually been as close to the idea that maybe nuclear weapons could be launched by one country and another country might respond. So I think that is by far the most significant international problem, and I don't think there's any real solution. We don't really have a military solution to it. We can pretend we do, but we don't. We can have a preemptive conventional attack, but we don't have the ability with a conventional attack to stop their conventional attack, North Korea's up against South Korea. And we don't know whether they could launch nuclear weapons as well. So we're not likely to do a conventional attack. We can't knock out their nuclear weapons. We don't know where they really are. We could, this might get my internet hacked, but we could kill Kim Jong-un if we wanted to. We have the capability to do that. We have the ability we have stealth drones that could go into North Korea airspace and we could find out where he is. We don't know where he is at any given time, but we could find out because he does surface from time to time. The problem is, the fear is if you do that, you don't know if you're getting something worse. And you don't know whether if he dies, somebody will launch a nuclear weapon in response. So it's not a good solution either. There is no compelling solution. That's number 1. Number 2, in my view, is something in the Middle East going wrong. Syria gets worse. Iraq gets worse. Iranian situation gets worse. There's a lot of problems in the Middle East, and used to be in the Middle East meant Israel-Palestine. That's now number 6 or 7 on the biggest issues there. Those are probably the 2 biggest concerns. Something in the Middle East relating to terrorism or some terrorist acts in the United States or Europe and North Korea.
You know, we've got 5 minutes or so here, and would it be okay if people, sure. Yeah. You know, he's just a man in motion, so if you have a question, this is your time.
No question? Well, I have a question. I'll ask you a question.
Yeah, no, but here, maybe there was a little movement, wasn't there? Yeah. Oh, domestically. Okay.
The biggest challenge domestically is the government is dysfunctional. When I worked in Congress, Democrats and Republicans actually talked to each other. They worked out deals. Now you're going to get a tax cut bill, most likely with not one Democratic vote, just as we had Obamacare with not one Republican vote. So the dysfunction of the government, the Congress, is sad, and the relationships between Congress and the executive branch, the current executive branch, is not very good, obviously. So there are real challenges. That's the biggest concern. The business community, business people, they can live with almost anything. Just tell us what's going to happen. And right now, we don't really know what's going on because we can't figure out what the president really wants to do. We can't understand what the tweets mean sometimes, what the policy is going to be. And in Congress, we don't really know, what they're going to do at any given moment. People ask me all the time, are you worried about political risks when you invest in China or the Middle East? I say, no, I worry about political risk mostly in the United States because I can't figure out what the United States government's going to do. I know Donald Trump, and I told him, I came to the Economic Club of Washington once, and I interviewed him. And he said in the green room, ask me any question you want, but ask 2 questions for sure. Ask me if I'm going to run for president. I said, President what? And he said, President of the United States. I said, Donald, you have no chance. Believe me, I'm a political expert. You have no chance of being president. What's the second question? Ask me if my hair is real. People think it's not, and then you can feel the hair. I said, well, I don't want to do that, but I'll ask you about your hair. Anyway, at the interview was over, he loved it. He sent me a letter afterwards saying, I'm going to make you an honorary member of Mar-a-Lago, whatever that means. And by the way, David, you should know, it was the highest rated show in the 35-year history of C-SPAN. It was covered live. So I called the president of C-SPAN. I said, what were the ratings? They said, there are no ratings. Nobody could know. Anyway, I think the dysfunction of the government is the biggest concern we have right now.
Yeah.
Would you share with us your own and mother's love
Right.
story?
Okay.
Tell us something about your mom.
Okay. I did a little bit of this I gave the Duke commencement speech this past year, and I relayed some of it, but here's the essence of it. My parents were not college educated or high school educated. My mother dropped out of high school to get married to my father. She really had no business sophistication and so forth. But she gave me, with my father, what every child should want, which is the unconditional love of parents. If you have the good fortune to have 2 parents who love each other and then love you, what more do you need in life? That's the biggest advantage you can get, not having money, but that's the biggest advantage. So my mother, when I was building Carlisle, she didn't understand business, and honestly, so the stock market would go down by 100 points. She'd say, are you guys going to go bankrupt? She didn't really understand what the market meant. So, but she never actually would call me and say, I just read that Carlisle took this company public and so forth, and you're doing well, or your company took it public, you did well. She didn't understand it really. But when I started giving away large sums of money, she would read about it, and she would, she would call me and say she's very proud. And if I would send her an article that says I did something in terms of giving away money, she would reread the article 15 times. I said, well, you read it once, it doesn't change the second and third and fourth time. But he would read it over and over again. And so I kind of adopted what I call the mother test, which is that if your mother is proud of what you're doing, what more do you want in life than that? And so I had invited her. Some of you heard my commencement speech. I invited her to come to the commencement speech this year because I I said, I'm stepping down as the chairman of the board at Duke, and this will be my last time I'll be the board chair on the stage. And she said, well, okay, who's the speaker? And I said, well, I'm the speaker. And she said, well, couldn't they get Oprah? And I said, no, they couldn't get Oprah. They already had Oprah. They got me. So I was going to talk about, it was on Mother's Day, and I was going to talk about the importance of mothers and honoring your mother and so forth. And, sadly, she died a few weeks before the speech. And so I gave the speech in her honor and said I was going to redouble my efforts to give back to my country. And I told everybody that it was important to do something that I should have done better, is to honor your parents when they're alive. My father was a Marine Corps veteran, but I didn't really do anything to honor him in a meaningful way. He didn't probably want anything, but I didn't do it. And then after he died, I read about the Iwo Jima Memorial, was in some trouble in falling down or whatever, some problems in Washington. So I went to the Marine Corps and said, look, I'll fix the memorial. I just like to do it in honor of my father. So I invited my mother up and surprised her, and she was very happy. And then I realized, wait a second, my mother might not live forever either. So I looked for something I could do to honor my mother. And so there was something being done in Washington, the Renwick Gallery, and was being redone as part of the Smithsonian. I'm the chairman of the Smithsonian, so I wanted to do something related to it. And so I renamed the major interior part of the gallery after her, and I invited her up by surprise. And to surprise her, and I invited her, and we walked up the steps to the Renwick, and then she saw her name in big type up there, and she was very thrilled. And she sat next to Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who came for the event. And I realized I was glad I had done that before she died, but I probably should have done more in my lifetime. So I tell people, honor your parents while they're alive, because it's a lot easier to do that than when they're gone. And so I tell particularly that to people roughly my age or a little bit younger whose parents are still alive. Don't wait to honor them when they're gone, because it's a lot better to do it when they're alive. I wish I had done more. Yes.
A lot. So, Louis.
Is there a favorite investment?
My favorite investment? Well, I like to talk about the ones that got away, but the ones we did, the one that we liked a lot was we bought a company called 49% of a company called Beats. Beats is a earphone thing, and when we were talking about doing it, it was built by two guys, Jimmy Iovine, who's a record producer, and then a guy named Dr. Dre, who I'd never honestly heard of because I don't know hip hop. But but to show them that we were hip and we should be the appropriate investor, they brought them to Carlyle's offices, and they said, because I'm the chairman of the Kennedy Center and therefore know something about entertainment, they thought, you go in and meet with Dr. Dre for a while and convince them that we're an appropriate group. So I go in there, and they didn't really know much about the Kennedy Center, but I didn't know much about hip hop either. So afterwards, Dr. Dre gets up, and he's big, and he's like 6'5" or 6" or something, and he's chiseled as could be. And I said, wow, you look like you work out a lot. He says, yeah, 4 hours a day. He says, what do you do? I said, 4 hours a year. And that's if I'm lucky. And so we did this investment, and we doubled our money in 6 months, and I sold it to Apple, and it was pretty good. But Carlyle did a takeoff on it, and one of our conferences, they wanted me to do a rap song. And so they hired a young African-American rap artist in Washington, D.C. to be my coach. And I was supposed to sing a rap song for this video. And so they said it would take 5 minutes and I'd go back to work. Well, I get there. It took 4 hours to get it done. And the man said later, Mr. Rubenstein, you are the whitest man I've ever seen in my life. But the Beats was a very good one. We did investment in China, which was transformative, where we made $4 or $5 billion in one investment in China. We've made 800 investments in corporate world, and we've averaged, I think, a gross internal rate of return of about 27%. But I always think of the ones that got away, the ones Mark Andreessen showed up at my office. I turned him down when he was starting Netscape. I thought it was ridiculous. I didn't even know what the internet was then. Jeff Bezos offered us a third of the companies I mentioned, and we turned that down. I turned Facebook down at the beginning. So I always, like the fisherman who talks about the fish that got away, I always talk about the deals that got away.
Okay, we'll take one more. David.
You helped transform Duke. Now looking in the future, if there was 1, 2, or 3 things that you would like to see
At Duke?
happen at Duke in the future that are not here now.
Okay. The university is fairly highly ranked, but the ranking is a little misleading because the ranking is higher than most individual components of the university. So one of the weakest parts of the university is the rankings of the graduate school departments. If you look at the graduate departments, they're not usually in the top 10 in the United States, with the exception of a couple departments. So the graduate school needs to be shored up. What also needs to be shored up dramatically is the sciences at Duke. Sciences cost a lot more money than humanities and arts and sciences, so we've built up the humanities and arts and sciences pretty nicely, but we've fallen down in sciences. We're not even ranked in the top 20 or 30 in some of the major areas like chemistry, physics, and so forth. So we need to build those up as well. I think the medical complex is an important asset to Duke, but it has slipped in the rankings and well below where it has been. So I think more money needs to go into the sciences. That's an important thing. I've been pushing to get our acceptance rate below 10% and our yield above 50% for undergraduates, because it's an important indicator. Duke, up until this past year, had never really had maybe 1 year exception, had a yield above 50%, which means that half the people that we accept aren't coming. And you want to have yields that are higher. Harvard's yield is 82%, and that's the highest in the country. So I think we should work hard to get people who want to come here and get our yield up, and also get an acceptance rate that's probably consistently closer to the Ivies, which are now around 4, 5, 6, and 7%. But the sciences are probably what we need to really put a lot of money into. I guess those are some things we need to do.
Okay, so David, listen, thank you so much for being here with us. I mean, this is really...
Let me just think about. So I'm going to stay for a few minutes. Something else happens, but let me just thank all of you for your support of Duke. All of you are here because you've supported Duke, and particularly the law school. David has done a spectacular job at the law school, obviously getting the rankings to #1, not easy to do. But the Duke Law School is really extremely well respected, but it's respected because it has the financial means to do the things that David and his successor I think are important. And so I want to thank all of you for participating in the capital campaign. The capital campaign at Duke turned out to be much more successful than we thought. It ended a few months ago, technically, but as you probably know, capital campaigns never end at universities. They are the gift that keeps on giving. And the truth is, the greatest American invention of the 20th century was the American Education Capital Campaign. So we always have capital campaigns, and while you make fun of them, the truth is they're necessary, and your participation in the capital campaign and your support of the law school and your presence here today and giving up your time is very helpful to Duke, and I want to thank you for doing that.
So we're going to be thanking everybody here in the room, but before we have our round of applause, let me just say, you were a great leader here at Duke, and I hope that you will continue to be such a leader and such a presence here at Duke. There's the tendency of people who've risen very high at Duke then just to fade away, and I think...
I'll tell you what, if I'll stay involved or you stay involved.
Well, that's a deal.
Okay, all right. Thank you. Thank you.
You know, I remember, I told this story last night, that, just to a couple of people, that I was on a private plane at one point, which doesn't happen very often with me, and I was texting with you, or emailing with you. You're a very good emailer, and you said, don't let him seduce you with his plane. And I said to you, well, David, I'm quite promiscuous. You can seduce me as well. But I've never been on your plane.
I'm flying to Princeton tonight after dinner. You want to go?
Well, maybe not. But thank you so very much.
All right, well, thank you.
You just were spectacular.